On March 31st, 1985, something happened in New York City that would change the entire entertainment industry forever. A professional wrestling event. A show put together by a man that most people in the business thought was clinically insane. An event so risky, so financially reckless, so absurdly ambitious that if it had failed, the entire World Wrestling Federation would have ceased to exist by the following Monday morning. Vince McMahon Jr. had taken over the World Wrestling Federation from his father in 1982. And from day one, he had a plan that terrified every single person in the professional wrestling business. He wanted to go national. He wanted to take a regional wrestling promotion based in the Northeast and turn it into a global entertainment powerhouse. He wanted to raid every territory in North America for their top talent, sign them exclusively to the WWE, and then promote events on a scale that the wrestling world had never seen before. The other promoters thought he was out of his mind. The wrestlers in his own locker room were nervous. Even his own wife, Linda McMahon, reportedly had serious doubts about the financial risks involved. But Vince McMahon did not care what anyone thought. He had a vision, and that vision was Wrestlemania. The problem was that vision cost money, a staggering amount of money. McMahon had been spending aggressively to sign talent from other territories. Hulk Hogan, Roddy Piper, the Iron Sheik, Jesse Ventura, Andre the Giant. These were not cheap acquisitions. On top of that, he was cross-promoting with MTV, producing television specials, running events in new markets, and now planning a massive closed-circuit television spectacular at Madison Square Garden that would be simulcast to arenas and theaters across the entire country. The bills were piling up fast, and the revenue was not keeping pace. By the time March 1985 rolled around, the World Wrestling Federation was flirting with bankruptcy. That is not an exaggeration. Multiple sources from that era have confirmed that Vince McMahon had to take out a second mortgage on his house. Some accounts say it was a third mortgage. The man had leveraged literally everything he owned on the success of a single wrestling show. If Wrestlemania flopped, if the closed-circuit numbers came in low, if the public decided they did not care about professional wrestling presented as mainstream entertainment, Vince McMahon would lose everything: his company, his home, his entire livelihood, and it almost did not happen at all. Because just 4 days before the biggest event in wrestling history, Hulk Hogan nearly destroyed the whole thing on live television. On March 27, 1985, Hogan and his Wrestlemania tag team partner Mr. T appeared on a cable talk show called Hot Properties, hosted by comedian Richard Belzer. The appearance was supposed to be a standard promotional spot. Come on the show, talk about WrestleMania, hype the main event, get some mainstream media coverage, simple stuff, routine stuff. It was not routine. Belzer was an acerbic, sarcastic comedian, the kind of guy who made his living by needling his guests, poking fun at them, pushing buttons to get laughs. And on this particular night, he decided to poke fun at professional wrestling. He mocked the business. He questioned whether any of it was real. He was antagonistic from the jump, taking shots at both Hogan and Mr. T throughout the interview. Now, in 1985, questioning the legitimacy of professional wrestling to a professional wrestler was essentially declaring war. The boys did not take kindly to outsiders calling their livelihood fake. They had a long and well-documented history of physically correcting people who crossed that line. And Belzer was tap dancing right on top of it. After several minutes of verbal sparring, Belzer made the fateful decision to ask Hogan to demonstrate a wrestling hold on him. Mr. T, who had been sitting quietly and stewing over Belzer's attitude, initially refused the request. He told Belzer they were not going to show him anything. If he wanted to see moves, he could buy a closed-circuit ticket to WrestleMania like everyone else. But Hogan had other ideas. He leaned over to Mr. T and whispered something that the microphones barely picked up. He wanted to make Belzer squeal. What happened next became one of the most infamous moments in television history. Hogan applied a front chin lock to Belzer. Now, a front chin lock, when applied properly, is essentially a blood choke. It cuts off the flow of blood to the brain. In the hands of a trained professional wrestler who knows exactly how much pressure to apply and when to release, it is a controlled technique, uncomfortable but manageable. In the hands of a man billed at over 300 pounds who was genuinely irritated and wanted to prove a point, it was something else entirely. Hogan squeezed. Belzer went limp almost immediately. His eyes rolled back. His body went slack. He was out cold, unconscious on live television. And then Hogan let go. Belzer dropped like a sack of cement. His head hit the stage floor with a sickening crack. Blood began pooling around his skull. The studio audience went silent. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody knew what to do. This was live cable television in 1985, and a man was bleeding on the floor. Belzer eventually came to. He was dazed, confused, blood trickling down the back of his head, but he was conscious enough to stumble through a transition to commercial break. He was taken to the hospital, where he received 9 stitches in the back of his skull. 2 years later, he filed a $5 million lawsuit against both Hogan and Mr. T. The case was eventually settled out of court for a reported $400,000. Belzer used the money to buy a home in the south of France, which he named Chez Hogan. You cannot make this stuff up. But here is the part that matters for our story. This happened 4 days before WrestleMania. 4 days. The biggest event in wrestling history, the event that the entire financial future of the company was riding on. And the main event star just choked out a television host on live TV and sent him to the hospital. If Belzer had been seriously injured, if there had been brain damage, if the incident had generated enough negative press to scare away the closed-circuit distributors or the celebrity guests or the mainstream media coverage that McMahon was counting on, WrestleMania could have been dead before it ever started. Vince McMahon, in a move that would define his career, reportedly loved every second of it. In his mind, any publicity was good publicity. And a story about Hulk Hogan knocking out a talk show host with a wrestling move was exactly the kind of mainstream attention that could sell tickets and closed-circuit buys. But the Belzer incident was not the only pre-show disaster McMahon had to navigate, because there was another problem brewing, a much more dangerous one, and it involved the main event itself. The WrestleMania main event was a tag team match, Hulk Hogan and Mr. T versus Roddy Piper and Paul Orndorff. Now, from a storytelling perspective, this was brilliant. Hogan was the biggest star in wrestling. Mr. T was one of the biggest stars in all of entertainment, fresh off the A-Team. Piper was the most hated villain in the business. And Orndorff was a legitimate tough guy who could carry the wrestling side of things. On paper, it was perfect. Behind the scenes, it was a powder keg. Roddy Piper hated Mr. T, not in the fun, professional wrestling kind of way where two guys pretend to dislike each other to sell tickets. Piper genuinely, viscerally despised the man. He saw Mr. T as an outsider, a Hollywood guy who had no business being in a wrestling ring, a celebrity who was coming into Piper's world, Piper's livelihood, and being positioned as an equal to men who had spent their entire lives learning the craft of professional wrestling. Mr. T, for his part, sensed the hostility, and it terrified him. In the days leading up to WrestleMania, Mr. T became increasingly nervous about getting in the ring with Piper. He was not a trained professional wrestler. He was an actor and a celebrity. And he was about to step into a ring with a man who had been wrestling since he was 15 years old and who clearly had no interest in making the experience pleasant for him. At the last minute, Mr. T tried to back out. He wanted to pull out of the main event entirely. The match that the entire show was built around. The match that every closed-circuit ticket had been sold on the promise of. The match that Vince McMahon had bet his house, his company, and his entire future on. It took Hulk Hogan himself to talk Mr. T off the ledge. Hogan assured him that he would be protected in the ring, that Piper would not hurt him, that everything would be fine. Mr. T eventually agreed to go through with it, but the situation had been genuinely touch and go. And here is where the story gets truly terrifying. Years later, after Roddy Piper had passed away, a podcast host named Chris Burns revealed a conversation he had once had with Piper about that night. According to Burns, Piper admitted that he had genuinely considered injuring Mr. T during the match. Not just roughing him up, not just being stiff with his strikes. Piper had thought about performing a back suplex on Mr. T and arching it in a specific way so that Mr. T would land on his neck. a move that, performed with malicious intent by someone who had been wrestling professionally since he was 15 years old, could have caused permanent paralysis or worse. Piper knew exactly how to make it look like an accident, a botched move, a momentary lapse in technique. Nobody would have been able to prove it was intentional, but he would have known. And Mr. T would have spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair, or worse. According to the account, Piper talked himself out of it because he did not want to be the man who ruined WrestleMania. Not because he cared about Mr. T, not because his conscience kicked in, but because he understood that destroying the main event of WrestleMania would have consequences for the entire wrestling business, for everyone in that locker room, for every man who depended on the WWE for their livelihood. So Mr. T walked out of WrestleMania 1 on his own 2 feet. But he might not have, and that is a detail that does not get discussed nearly enough when people talk about the first WrestleMania. Now, Piper also flat out refused to let Mr. T pin him. In his mind, there was no scenario in which a non-wrestler was going to hold his shoulders to the mat for a 3 count. He was not going to let someone come into his business and treat him like a clown. So the finish of the match was adjusted. Instead of Piper taking the pin, his partner Paul Orndorff took the fall after Cowboy Bob Orton accidentally hit Orndorff with his arm cast while trying to hit Hogan. Hogan got the pin. Piper never had to look at the lights. And the first WrestleMania main event ended with the good guys winning and the bad guys retreating. But even with Piper cooperating enough to get through the match, the main event had another massive problem, and his name was Muhammad Ali. Ali had been announced as the special guest referee for the main event. This was a huge deal. Muhammad Ali was arguably the most famous athlete on the planet. Having him involved in WrestleMania was a coup of epic proportions. It legitimized the event in a way that nothing else could have. When Muhammad Ali shows up to your wrestling show, the whole world pays attention. The problem was that by March 1985, Ali was not the same man he had once been. He had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease the year before. His motor functions were declining, his speech was slowing, his reflexes were not what they had been. When Ali arrived at Madison Square Garden on the day of the show, Pat Patterson, one of the WWE's top agents and the man responsible for putting together the matches, took one look at Ali and knew they had a problem. Ali was not in good enough shape, mentally or physically, to referee a professional wrestling match. The timing, the positioning, the physical demands of being inside the ring and reacting to the action in real time. It was too much. An audible was called. Patterson himself would take over as the in-ring referee. Ali was moved to a newly created role as a special outside enforcer. He would stand at ringside and look important, but he would not be responsible for any of the actual officiating duties inside the ring. This was a wise decision, because even in his reduced role, Ali caused problems. During the match, when all 4 men began brawling simultaneously, Ali got caught up in the moment. He climbed into the ring. He was not supposed to be in the ring. He was explicitly told to stay outside. But the competitive fire that had defined his entire career kicked in, and before anyone could stop him, he was in there throwing punches at Roddy Piper. Backstage, WWE agent George Scott watched in horror. He had to physically run out from behind the curtain, get to ringside, grab Ali by the arm, and lead him back to his position outside the ring. If Ali had gotten hurt, if he had taken a bump, if he had been knocked down or fallen in a way that aggravated his condition, the lawsuit would have been catastrophic. The negative publicity would have been devastating. And the image of Muhammad Ali being injured at a wrestling show would have set the entire industry back decades. But Ali did not get hurt. Patterson got him back where he belonged. The match continued, and the crisis was averted. Barely. Now, everything we have talked about so far has been behind-the-scenes drama. The stuff the audience did not know about. Let us talk about what the audience actually saw that night. Because if you go back and watch WrestleMania 1 today, what strikes you immediately is how rough the actual show was. Start with the production. Modern WrestleMania features massive stadium setups, elaborate entrance stages, pyrotechnics, LED screens, lighting rigs that cost more than most houses. WrestleMania 1 featured a dark arena where only the ring was lit. The audience was almost entirely invisible. You could hear them, but you could barely see them. It felt small. It felt cheap. It felt like a regular house show with slightly better cameras. There was none of the spectacle that would come to define WrestleMania in later years. The opening of the show set the tone perfectly. And by perfectly, I mean badly. Vince McMahon needed someone to sing the national anthem. In later years, WrestleMania would feature celebrities performing America the Beautiful, Aretha Franklin, Ray Charles, John Legend, massive stars performing for a massive audience. But in 1985, the celebrity guest who had been booked to sing failed to show up at the last minute. To this day, neither McMahon nor Okerlund ever publicly revealed who it was supposed to be. So with no backup plan, Vince pulled ring announcer Mean Gene Okerlund aside and told him he was up. Mean Gene Okerlund singing the national anthem at the first WrestleMania. Look, Gene was a beloved figure in professional wrestling, one of the greatest interviewers and personalities the business has ever produced. But he was not a singer. He was not a performer in that sense. And what the audience got was essentially a wrestling announcer doing karaoke at the most important show in company history. He turned it into an audience sing-along, which was smart, because it covered up the fact that he was not exactly Whitney Houston up there. Then the matches started, and this is where things really get rough. The very first match in WrestleMania history was Tito Santana versus a man called the Executioner. Now, the Executioner was actually Buddy Rose, wearing a mask. He was a jobber, an enhancement talent, a guy whose sole purpose was to lose and make the other guy look good. The first match in the history of the biggest annual event in professional wrestling was a squash match, a popular babyface beating up a guy in a mask that nobody cared about. It lasted less than 5 minutes. And it set absolutely no tone for the evening whatsoever. If the first match of a WrestleMania is supposed to grab the audience and tell them they are in for something special, this match grabbed the audience and told them they were watching a Tuesday night house show in Poughkeepsie. Match 2. King Kong Bundy versus S.D. Jones. And this is where we get to one of the most infamous problems of WrestleMania 1. This match was announced as lasting 9 seconds, a new record for the shortest match in WWE history. Bundy destroyed Jones in what was presented as a historic squash. Except it was a lie. Go back and watch the match. Time it yourself. It runs at least 20 seconds. Some counts put it closer to 23 or 24. The 9-second claim was completely fabricated. The WWE just made up a number that sounded more impressive and ran with it. The very first WrestleMania, the show that was supposed to establish professional wrestling as a legitimate mainstream entertainment product, featured a fake record and a fake sport. The irony is almost too perfect. But beyond the fudged time, the match itself was a disaster from an entertainment perspective. It was another squash match, another jobber getting destroyed. The crowd barely reacted because there was nothing to react to. S.D. Jones might as well have been a tackling dummy. Match 3 was Ricky Steamboat versus Matt Bourne. Now, Steamboat was legitimately great, one of the best in-ring performers of his generation, a man who moved with a speed and athleticism that was years ahead of his time. But the match was given almost no time. It was over before it really got started. Steamboat won, the crowd popped, and everyone moved on, a complete waste of one of the best talents on the roster. Match 4 was David Sammartino, son of the legendary Bruno Sammartino, against Brutus Beefcake. Now, on paper, having Bruno Sammartino involved in your wrestling show should be a big deal. Bruno was one of the biggest draws in the history of the New York territory. The problem was that David Sammartino was not Bruno Sammartino. He was a perfectly adequate but deeply unspectacular wrestler who happened to have a famous last name. The match itself was forgettable, and it ended in a double disqualification when the managers on both sides got involved. A double disqualification. At WrestleMania. No winner, no loser, no resolution, no point. The match ran nearly 12 minutes, which made it the longest undercard match on the card, and it ended in the most unsatisfying way possible. Match 5 was the Intercontinental Championship match. Greg Valentine defending against Junkyard Dog. This should have been a significant match. The Intercontinental title was the second most important championship in the company. Valentine was a credible champion. Junkyard Dog was massively popular, but the match itself was booked in the most confusing way imaginable. Valentine pinned Junkyard Dog with his feet on the ropes. Illegal leverage. Tito Santana ran down and told the referee what happened. The match was restarted. And then Junkyard Dog won by countout when Valentine simply did not get back in the ring. But here is the catch. Titles do not change hands on a countout. So Valentine kept his championship. Junkyard Dog won the match but did not win the title. The babyface got his hand raised but gained absolutely nothing. The heel kept his belt. Nobody in the building got what they actually wanted. It was the kind of booking that makes you wonder if anyone involved in planning the show had ever actually watched a wrestling event before. Match 6 was the Tag Team Championship match. The US Express defending against the Iron Sheik and Nikolai Volkov. This was actually one of the better matches on the card, which is not saying much. The heels won the titles after some interference, and the crowd was appropriately upset about it. But even this match was hampered by the time constraints that plagued the entire show. Match 7. The Body Slam Challenge between Andre the Giant and Big John Studd. On paper, a match between the most famous giant in wrestling history and a massive villain should be a spectacle. In practice, it was nearly 6 minutes of two enormous men who could barely move hugging each other in the center of the ring. Bear hugs, rest holds, slow, plodding movement. The match was a body slam challenge, meaning all Andre had to do was slam Studd to win. So naturally, Andre slammed Studd at the end, and the crowd went crazy. But they may have been cheering out of relief that it was over, rather than genuine excitement about what they had just watched. Match 8 was the Women's Championship match. Wendy Richter, accompanied by Cyndi Lauper, versus Leilani Kai, accompanied by the fabulous Moolah. The celebrity involvement was the draw here. Cyndi Lauper was at the peak of her fame. Girls Just Want to Have Fun was still everywhere. The rock and wrestling connection between the WWE and the music industry was in full swing. But the match itself was rough. The timing was off throughout. The moves looked sloppy, the transitions were awkward. The biggest reactions came not from anything the wrestlers did, but from the moments when the managers got involved at ringside. Cyndi Lauper getting physical with the fabulous Moolah generated more crowd noise than anything that happened inside the ring. When your managers are more over than your match, you have a problem. And then, 9 matches into a 2-hour show, we got to the main event. Hulk Hogan and Mr. T versus Roddy Piper and Paul Orndorff, with Muhammad Ali at ringside trying not to climb into the ring. With Billy Martin as the guest ring announcer. With Liberace as the guest timekeeper, dancing with the Rockettes to New York before the match started, because apparently that is something that needed to happen. The main event was, in fairness, the best thing on the show. It had energy. It had heat. The crowd was invested. Piper and Orndorff were excellent heels who bumped and sold and made everything look good. Hogan was Hogan, which in 1985 meant he was the most charismatic man in the entire entertainment industry. And Mr. T, despite having essentially zero wrestling training, managed to get through the match without anyone getting killed. But even the main event had its issues. Mr. T was visibly limited in the ring. There were moments where he got caught in the heel corner and clearly did not know what to do. Piper had to guide him through almost every exchange, which must have been particularly galling for a man who had been fantasizing about breaking his neck. The match ran about 13 minutes, which was actually the longest match on the card, and it ended with the cast shot from Bob Orton that accidentally hit the wrong man. It was fine. It was fun. It was not a classic by any stretch of the imagination. And speaking of the overall card, let us talk about the elephant in the room. Or rather, the championship that was not in the room. WrestleMania 1 is the only WrestleMania in history that did not feature a World Championship match. Think about that. The biggest show of the year. The event that was supposed to establish professional wrestling as a major entertainment product. And the WWE World Heavyweight Championship was not defended. Hulk Hogan was the champion, but he was wrestling in a tag team match. The title was not on the line. The most prestigious prize in the company was essentially irrelevant on the biggest night in company history. Every single WrestleMania after the first one has featured a world title match. It took them exactly one show to realize that was a mistake. Now let us talk about the show as a whole, in terms of pure numbers. 9 matches in approximately 2 hours. Most of those matches running between 5 and 6 minutes. The longest match on the entire card was the main event at roughly 13 minutes. The second longest was the Sammartino Beefcake double disqualification at about 11.5 minutes. Everything else was a sprint, or more accurately, a jog. A very slow, very uneventful jog. If you added up all the actual in-ring wrestling time from WrestleMania 1, you would get roughly an hour. Maybe a little more, maybe a little less, depending on how you count the pre-match and post-match shenanigans. 1 hour of wrestling on a 2-hour show. The rest was promos, backstage segments, celebrity introductions, and Mean Gene Okerlund doing his best to fill time by interviewing anyone who walked past him. And those promos, those backstage segments. If the matches were rough, the acting in the promos was rougher. Some of the pre-match interviews featured comically bad acting from wrestlers who were clearly not comfortable speaking on camera in a quasi-scripted format. The WWE was in the process of transitioning from the old-school promo style, where guys just talked naturally and with passion, to a more produced, entertainment-focused approach. And in 1985, they had not figured out the balance yet. The result was a series of awkward, stilted promos that felt like they belonged in a high school drama class rather than on a nationally broadcast wrestling event. Then there was the issue of closed-circuit television, a hurdle that further underscored just how risky WrestleMania 1 truly was. In 1985, traditional pay-per-view as we understand it today simply was not an option. The technology existed only in a limited capacity and was nowhere near widespread enough to support a nationwide event of this scale. As a result, WrestleMania 1 relied primarily on closed-circuit television, an outdated and logistically demanding method of distribution that required fans to leave their homes entirely. Instead of ordering the event from their living rooms, viewers had to physically travel to a participating venue, usually a movie theater, civic center, or sports arena, purchase a ticket, and watch the show projected onto a large screen. While a handful of select markets offered the event through extremely limited pay-per-view access, those cases were the exception rather than the rule. For the overwhelming majority of wrestling fans, closed-circuit television was the only way to experience WrestleMania live. This approach created a massive logistical challenge for the WWF. Dozens of venues across the United States had to be secured well in advance, each requiring coordination with local operators and theater owners. Specialized projection and satellite equipment had to be installed at every location, often by technicians unfamiliar with broadcasting live sports entertainment. Staff needed to be hired and trained, ticketing systems put in place, and contingency plans developed in case something went wrong. And things often did go wrong. This was an era before high-speed internet, digital streaming, or even truly reliable satellite feeds. Signal dropouts, audio issues, and projection failures were real concerns, and a single technical failure at any location could leave hundreds, or even thousands, of fans staring at a blank screen. Unlike modern pay-per-view broadcasts, where issues can be resolved centrally, closed-circuit problems had to be handled locally, often under intense pressure and with limited technical support. Despite these obstacles, WrestleMania 1 drew an astonishing audience. More than 1 million people watched the event through closed-circuit television, an incredible figure considering the barriers involved. That level of turnout validated Vince McMahon's gamble and proved that professional wrestling could attract a mass audience willing to pay a premium for a special event. However, the viewing experience itself was far from ideal by modern standards. Fans were confined to crowded venues, subject to inconsistent audio and video quality, and unable to control how or where they watched the show. There were no instant replays, no alternate camera angles, and no pause button, just a single live feed projected onto a screen. Oh, and one more thing about the night of the show. Just before WrestleMania was set to begin, a group of Hell's Angels on Harley-Davidson motorcycles rode through the loading dock of Madison Square Garden, past security, and into the backstage area. They wanted to see the show. The show was completely sold out. There were no tickets available. But a group of bikers had just invaded the building, and they were not the kind of people you ask politely to leave. WWE management, in what might be the most pragmatic decision in company history, simply accommodated them. They brought in a few extra chairs. The Hells Angels watched WrestleMania. Nobody got hurt, nobody got kicked out. It was handled with the kind of casual, whatever-works attitude that defined the early days of the WWE. Imagine that happening today. A biker gang breaking into the arena at Wrestlemania. The security consultants and legal teams would have simultaneous heart attacks. There is one more thing worth mentioning that most people do not know about. The night before WrestleMania, Hulk Hogan and Mr. T hosted Saturday Night Live. This was actually a last-minute substitution. Comedian Steve Landesberg was originally scheduled to host, but had to drop out due to a family emergency. Hogan and Mr. T were brought in because they were already in New York for WrestleMania, and the show needed a host immediately. The Saturday Night Live appearance went far better than the infamous Belzer incident, thankfully. There were no injuries, no lawsuits, and no uncomfortable fallout. Just a genuinely entertaining segment that allowed wrestling to laugh at itself for once. The most memorable moment came when Billy Crystal, performing in character as his flamboyant talk show host Fernando, fixated on Hulk Hogan's visibly heaving pectoral muscles. His exaggerated admiration caused both Hulk Hogan and Mr. T to completely break character and burst out laughing on live television. It was unscripted, human, and oddly charming, exactly the kind of moment that made SNL cultural currency. But the real importance of the appearance had little to do with jokes or sketches. Its significance lay in what it symbolized. A professional wrestler hosting Saturday Night Live was almost unthinkable in 1985. Wrestling was not considered cool, sophisticated, or culturally relevant. It wasn't something associated with Hollywood, comedy elites, or late-night television credibility. Wrestling lived in a separate world, one that aired early on Saturday mornings, played to regional crowds, and was largely dismissed by critics as lowbrow entertainment. To the mainstream media, wrestling was something consumed by kids, blue-collar workers, and die-hard fans who existed outside the cultural tastemakers of New York and Los Angeles. It certainly wasn't something you expected to see embraced by one of television's most influential comedy institutions. And yet, there was Hogan, front and center, not as a novelty act or punchline, but as the host. There is also the uncomfortable fact that WrestleMania 1 is the only WrestleMania in history where the show felt like it was running out of things to do. 9 matches in 2 hours sounds like a packed card. But when most of those matches are 5 minutes long and half of them are squash matches or unsatisfying finishes, you end up with a lot of dead air. The backstage interviews were clearly being used to fill time rather than enhance storytelling. Alfred Hayes, standing near the locker room entrance, catching wrestlers as they walked by, asking them how they felt about their upcoming matches. The answers were almost always variations of the same theme. I am going to win. My opponent does not stand a chance. Let me tell you something, brother. It was filler, pure and simple. The kind of content that exists not because it adds to the show, but because the show needs to be a certain length, and the matches are not long enough to get it there. Compare this to modern WrestleMania, where every segment is meticulously planned, where video packages are produced with the precision of a Hollywood trailer, where the pacing of the show is treated as seriously as the matches themselves. In 1985, the pacing was essentially non-existent. The show lurched from one short match to the next with awkward transitions and dead spots that killed whatever momentum a match might have built. And then, the legacy issues. When WrestleMania 1 was eventually released on DVD and later on the WWE network, the show was altered in ways that changed the historical record. Entrance themes were replaced due to music licensing issues. Most famously, Hulk Hogan's original entrance theme of Eye of the Tiger by Survivor was swapped out for Real American by Rick Derringer, which would become his iconic theme going forward, but was not what played when he walked to the ring that night. All references to the WWE were edited out due to the legal dispute with the World Wildlife Fund. The show that exists on modern platforms is not exactly the show that aired on March 31, 1985. It is a sanitized, legally compliant version of history. The real WrestleMania 1, the one that actually happened, exists only in the memories of the people who were there and in bootleg recordings that have circulated among collectors for decades. And let us also talk about what happened to the event that was almost called the Colossal Tussle. Yes, that was the original name Vince McMahon wanted for his wrestling extravaganza. The Colossal Tussle. Imagine that on a marquee. Imagine that as the name of a global brand worth billions of dollars. The Colossal Tussle 41, coming to you live from Las Vegas. It does not quite have the same ring to it, does it? The name Wrestlemania was actually suggested by ring announcer Howard Finkel, who made the connection to Beatlemania, the cultural phenomenon that swept America when the Beatles arrived in 1964. It was a perfect name, simple, memorable, evocative, and it probably saved the entire franchise from being remembered as the promotion that tried to sell tickets to something called the Colossal Tussle. So where does all of this leave us? What do we actually think about WrestleMania 1 when we strip away the nostalgia, the historical significance, and the knowledge of everything that came after? Honestly, it was not a very good show. The match quality was poor. Most of the card consisted of short, uneventful bouts that would not have been out of place on a random television taping. The production was primitive even by 1985 standards. The promos were hit or miss, with more misses than hits. The celebrity involvement, which was supposed to be the show's biggest selling point, was a mixed bag at best. Mr. T almost backed out. Muhammad Ali was too sick to do his job properly. Liberace danced with the Rockettes. Billy Martin announced some names. Mean Gene sang the national anthem. The main event was the clear highlight, and even that was a deeply imperfect match that was held together more by the charisma of its participants than by any actual wrestling quality. When Dave Meltzer, the most respected wrestling critic in the world, reviews WrestleMania 1, the star ratings tell the story. Most matches hover between 1 and 2 stars. The main event gets a respectable but not spectacular rating. Nothing on the show comes close to being considered a classic. Retrospective reviews have generally ranked WrestleMania 1 as one of the most average WrestleManias in history. And that is being generous. If you account for the fact that there are over 40 WrestleManias to compare it to, and many of the later ones feature 3, 4, even 5-star matches from top to bottom, WrestleMania 1 sits comfortably near the bottom of most rankings. But here is the thing, and this is important. None of that matters. WrestleMania 1 was never really about the matches. It was never about star ratings or work rate or match quality. It was about proving something. It was about proving that professional wrestling could be a mainstream entertainment product, that it could attract celebrities and media coverage and mainstream attention, that a wrestling show could be an event, not just a card, that people would pay money to watch wrestling in a theater on a closed-circuit screen because the spectacle was big enough and the stars were bright enough to justify the investment. And on that level, WrestleMania 1 was a resounding, overwhelming, history-altering success. Over 19,000 people filled Madison Square Garden. Over 1 million viewers watched on closed circuit. The mainstream media covered the event extensively. The celebrities who appeared became part of wrestling lore. And Vince McMahon did not lose his house. Everything that came after, every stadium show, every record-breaking gate, every mainstream crossover, every billion-dollar television deal, all of it traces back to March 31st, 1985, and a deeply flawed, chaotic, messy wrestling show in New York City that somehow, against all odds, against all logic, against the wishes of nearly everyone in the wrestling business who thought Vince McMahon had lost his mind, worked. WrestleMania 1 had a comedian getting choked unconscious on live TV 4 days before the show. It had a main eventer who genuinely considered paralyzing his opponent. It had a boxing legend who was too sick to do his job and kept jumping into the ring when he was supposed to stay outside. It had a biker gang breaking through security. It had fake match time records. It had a jobber main eventing the opening match. It had a double disqualification that went nowhere. It had 2 giants hugging each other for 6 minutes. It had a women's match where the managers were more entertaining than the wrestlers. It had a ring announcer singing the national anthem. It had promos with acting so bad it would make a soap opera blush. And it had the single most important person in the company leveraged to his eyeballs with no financial safety net whatsoever. Like and subscribe for more deep dives into wrestling history. Until next time.